Welcome back to another business special from DW. This week looking at how Russia is working around Western sanctions to try to keep its war machine running. I'm Christy Pladsen in Berlin, and I'm happy to welcome Michael Rochlitz. He's a professor of institutional economics and a Russia analyst at the University of Bremen in Germany. Thanks for joining us today, Michael. Before we jump into this topic, tell me, what do you think? Has Russia outsmarted Western sanctions?
Hello, Christy. No, I don't think so. And this has been a bit debate during the last couple of weeks and months that the sanctions have hit Russia less hard than many people have expected before, but this is not the case. The sanctions will have a long-term impact that will be catastrophic for the Russian economy. And what we have seen a bit during the last months is that the Russian central bank and some Russian institutions were very kind of efficient in dampening the short-term effects of the sanctions. So it's a bit like if you have a patient that has appendicitis and you give him a lot of paracetamol and painkillers, so this patient is not really feeling the effects right now. But what we will see during this year and probably in the years to come are the long-term effects of the sanctions, and they will really be like much more serious than what we've seen until now.
Okay, so you're saying Russia is actually still quite sick, despite what we might be seeing right now. I mean, diving into this a little closer and jumping off of what you said, I mean, as you said, at first glance, Russia does seem to be successfully working around sanctions from the European Union and Group of Seven nations, which they have instituted to keep crucial parts like semiconductors and other technologies away from Russia because of its war in Ukraine. Now, the EU and G7 countries, which does include the US, have introduced multiple rounds of sanctions since the invasion of Ukraine a year ago in an effort to weaken Russia's war machine and its economy. Now, data has suggested that the real impact in some areas is falling short of what officials might have hoped for, though, as you said, this is a fact that's disputed. Now, what we do know is that Russian imports overall have largely returned to their pre-war 2020 levels, and an analysis of trade data suggests that advanced chips and integrated circuits made in the EU and other allied nations are being shipped to Russia through third countries such as Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, and Kazakhstan. And the data shows that the value of exports to Russia are back to where they were before the war. Now, when we say export value, Michael, does this mean that the same overall amount of stuff is flowing into Russia, or is Russia paying more and getting less right now?
Yeah, there are a couple of points that one has to discuss when thinking about it. So first of all, about the quality of the data, we don't really know if the information that we get from Russia, much information is no longer published. So we don't really know how much stuff Russia is importing. What we know is what countries are exporting to Russia. But here as well, it's not like the same quality of information. What Russia is trying to do is to circumvent the sanctions by importing goods through third countries. And for example, through Kazakhstan, through Georgia, Armenia, Turkey, India, China. But this is way more complicated than directly importing things. First of all, you have to pay for like the additional intermediate agents that are kind of also getting their share. Second, many of these goods fall under the sanctions, so it's so the exporters or the producers don't really want these goods to arrive in Russia. So what countries do, like Kazakhstan or traders in Kazakhstan, they buy these goods for themselves, and then without the knowledge of the producers, they resell them to Russia. And at a certain margin. So sometimes the producers are actually unhappy that this is taking place because they're afraid that then these goods might be used to build, for example, Russian weapons. And then if a producer like Bosch, for example, produces some parts which are then used for a Russian missile, this missile hits a kindergarten, for example, in Ukraine, and it becomes known that some of the parts in the missile are from Bosch, Bosch really gets into trouble. So producers as well are kind of trying to prevent this from happening. And so what Russia is doing, they sometimes try to buy so-called dual-use goods, which can be also used for other things, and then they just buy a fridge or some kind of technology goods and then use the chips from these goods for their defense industry, but which is a way more expensive way than buying these chips directly from the producers. So,
well, about that quickly, Michael. So talking about it being more expensive, I want to ask you, I mean, does Russia have the cash to cover this increased cost right now? I mean, I know Moscow decided to sell some of its gold to cover a budget deficit in January. We know that oil and gas revenues aren't where they are. I mean, do they have the money to pay this premium?
Yeah, this is a very good question. And they had the money in 2022. We kind of underestimated the amount of cash that was flowing into Russia in 2022. Because of the skyrocketing oil and gas prices, Russia had way more cash available than initially expected. And they were using this cash both to kind of to cushion the effect of the sanctions on the Russian economy by continuing to pay salaries, by continuing to keep companies afloat and to dampen the effects in the country. But they also used it to buy products from abroad and to buy these chips at higher prices. This was possible in 2022. Now oil prices have fallen again, and especially prices for Russian oil exports and gas exports. And Russia already in January and February 2023 has big financial difficulties and has now difficulties to finance its budget. So this money is no longer there, and it's no longer as easy as a couple of months ago to finance these increasing costs.
All right, so this is a big hit to Russia's budget then, paying for these margins from these third parties that you were talking about. I mean, diving in a little bit deeper into what you were just saying, several countries have significantly increased exports to Russia, as you said, since the war began, and these have been a key driver in the recovery of Russian imports. Now, China has emerged by far as the largest supplier to Russia, with Belarus, Turkey, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, and Uzbekistan also significantly increasing exports to Russia. Now, these countries have increased exports of domestically produced goods, but some have also experienced substantial increases in imports from other countries. So they're bringing in goods from other countries into their country and then exporting it out to Russia. Armenia, for example, saw a sharp increase in imports of mobile phones from the world and a corresponding increase in mobile phone exports to Russia. So, Michael, you mentioned this a little bit, but I want to talk about this more closely, about the types of products that are being exported here. I mean, we know smartphones, washing machines, refrigerators are also something we're hearing about a lot. Talk to me more about why these products have been the ones that we're talking about here.
So we have seen an increase in sales of consumer goods, for example, from China. China is trying to fill in the gaps of Western companies that have left Russia by selling consumer goods that are produced in China to the Russian market. But what we haven't seen is, for example, high technology good exports to Russia, or not the same quantities, because China in this aspect is still very hesitant. And although there might be a shift now in the last couple of weeks, what we observed until recently, China was very hesitant to sell high-tech goods to Russia, and especially to the Russian defense industry, because China was also a bit afraid of secondary sanctions. For China, the European market and the market in the US is still way more important than the Russian market, and they don't want to sacrifice or endanger their trade with the European Union and the US by selling sensitive goods to Russia. What we've also seen is that we have seen these secondary imports of goods that might be on the sanctions list, and which then countries trying to sell them to Russia without the producers knowing. And this is now something that the European Union tries to address in this last 10th package of sanctions, where there was also an effort to make it more difficult for countries like Kazakhstan, for example, to resell goods to Russia. And for example, by threatening that Kazakhstan will then get problems with its ties to the European market when it continues to provide Russia with goods and imports.
Sure. I mean, talking about the high-tech technology, for example, I mean, I wanted to ask you if these exports into Russia are about keeping the domestic market they're supplied, or if it's more about supplying the Russian army with technology like microchips that it's been cut off from, but which it needs to keep fighting a 21st century war. I mean, what role is the military playing in this whole story?
So both factors play a role. On the one hand, you obviously want to keep the domestic market like provisions of high-tech goods, of cell phones, and also that the population has the perception or the feeling that things are more or less normal. This is what Putin and his governments try to convey, that the sanctions are not hitting, and so that if you go to a supermarket, you still can buy Western-made or smartphones and other technology goods. And then the other problem is obviously that if you want to repair your weapon systems and you want to use modern weapon systems, you need these parts which Russia is itself not producing. They bought them from abroad, from international markets and from Western suppliers, and now have big difficulties to supply them, which we already see in the war effort, that much of the weaponry and the material that is being used by the Russian army are not high-tech weapons. These are not the weapons that Putin presented 4 or 5 years ago. These are weapons that were developed in the 60s and the 70s, and tanks and systems that are relatively simple. And even here, Russia has difficulties to maintain its production and to maintain this war effort. But computer chips is a good example. In computer chips, there's a worldwide shortage of computer chips anyway. Even China has difficulties to supply its markets with computer chips. And then here, Russia really has difficulties to supply its industry, and especially its defense industry.
Right. Now, this story about Russia getting around sanctions, our viewers might have seen a bit about this story since the war broke out. I mean, would you say that this is a story of cunning on Russia's part, or is it one of desperation? I mean, how long can they keep up this kind of workflow, so to speak?
Yeah, this is a good question, because in a way it shows that the sanctions are working. If you have to find some kind of circumventions, and which are too more expensive, less efficient, it shows that the primary sanctions are working because you have to find these circumventions. And so the sanctions are imposing a cost on the Russian economy, which is the primary objective of the sanctions. You want to increase the cost of continuing the war, and this is happening. And sorry, I forgot the second part of the question.
No, it's okay. Yeah, so I'm basically saying that yeah, it's a sign that sanctions are working. Basically, I mean, it's not just former Soviet states and countries close to Moscow that are sending supplies to Russia. In February, German authorities raided offices of 3 companies they suspect of violating EU sanctions against Russia here in Germany. One of the businesses, which calls itself an IT wholesaler, has been accused of selling at least $20 million worth of components to Russia via an intermediary company in Turkey, a non-EU country that doesn't enforce many of the West sanctions against Moscow. Now, the parts included microchips, as we were speaking about, and electronic components manufactured in the U.S. Now, Germany's economy minister Robert Habeck was not too pleased about that. This is what he has to say.
Wir haben uns in den letzten Tagen und Wochen noch einmal sehr genau die Handelsströme und die Außenhandelsdaten angeschaut. Und was ich hier mitteilen muss, ist nicht erfreulich. Es gibt deutliche Umgehung der Sanktionen und es gibt auch deutliche Umgehung aus Deutschland heraus der Sanktionen.
Now, Habeck refers there to clear circumvention from Germany. Tell me, where is this occurring, and how is it possible, considering Germany's in a strong position to adhere to sanctions?
Yeah, but in a way, this shows that the sanctions are being observed in a much, how to say, like a stricter way in 2022 and 2023 than in 2014. We had the first wave of sanctions in 2014, and then I spoke to colleagues in Russia, also to businesses in Russia, and what they told me is that actually in 2014 it was pretty easy to circumvent these sanctions, and there was not much like pressure, and there were always some channels and some possibilities to go around them, and then it wasn't that difficult, and that what is happening since February 2022 is a completely different game. And that now the European Union and the German authorities are really looking hard to find companies that are circumventing the sanctions. They're still finding some of them, but not that many, is a sign that the sanctions are really working and that they're imposed in a completely different way. And so I think really what we see here is a completely different regime. We have never seen this amount of sanctions imposed against a single economy, a single country, and also sanctions imposed in such a strict way, and that there really seems to be a political will on the side of the German authorities and also the European and the US authorities to make these sanctions work. And at least from my evaluation, I would say that we will see these sanctions to continue for that there's clear signals from authorities in Western countries that are this time trying to really stick to these sanctions.
I mean, how do these Western countries actually make companies within their borders stick to sanctions? How does that work?
So you have different levels that you can use. I mean, these companies, many of them have their primary business interests on the European market or on the US market, and you can just tell them, I mean, if you continue make business with Russia, we will just make it impossible for you to work or to trade in our countries, and that the imposed costs are often, in most cases, much larger than the costs of stopping their business with Russia. And so most companies then just have to decide and what is economically feasible for them, and if it's worth the cost of continuing to do business with Russia.
I mean, that would have been my next question, actually, as well as, I mean, to what degree, if we look at the numbers, it must be clear to Western companies that if Kazakhstan, for example, has a huge increase of imports and then also exports into Russia, that something might be going on there. I mean, do we know to what degree Western companies are turning a blind eye to this behavior? It sounds like you're saying this is a calculation that they do make.
Yes, I think we have what we see here is a process, and then we had the imposition of the sanctions, and then there were these stopgap measures that Russia was trying to use to import parts and technology goods from third sources through third countries such as Kazakhstan or Armenia or Georgia or other countries. And then this worked for a couple of months, and then the firms have to react, the countries have to react. But we are already seeing that this is getting more difficult over time. And this is not the long-term way of securing basically the economic future or the economic viability of the Russian economy. And they can't compete on, well, they might be able to maintain their war effort for a couple of months, a couple of years to go, and with focusing on less sophisticated technologies and trying to get like small amounts of chips to repair the high-tech goods they need to repair. But so it's getting more difficult and it's costly. And then the elephant in the room, the big question is, to fight a war of this magnitude, you need a working economy. And the sanctions really have already hit very hard the Russian economy. And here we see enormous damage already inflicted. And the predictions on the future development of the Russian economy are really very dark and very bleak.
I mean, yeah, to close out, I'd like to ask you a question looking forward into the future. I mean, if we imagine a post-war world and a world where these sanctions were to disappear, what do you think would happen? I mean, how do you see these sort of strange dynamics that we're now seeing developing were the war to end?
So if you think about Russia and the Russian economy, even if the sanctions would end tomorrow, the damage that has already been inflicted is massive. There's a lot of loss of trust by investors. I mean, would you want to invest again into a country where, for political reasons, in 3 and 5 and 7 years, the change of government, and again, there's a risk of being expropriated, a risk of another armed conflict, another round of sanctions. So investor confidence is now way lower than it was 5-10 years ago. Another big problem is the science and the research sector in the country. Russia is an economy that is mostly based on oil and gas exports and has to think about what kind of economic future Russia wants to have and how to diversify its economy away from these natural resources. A bit like countries on the Gulf are already trying to, I mean, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and other countries try to get away from oil and gas and to build a science sector, a tourism sector. And these debates are not at all held in Russia at the moment. On the contrary, what we have seen during the last year, for example, on the science sector, many institutions that have been built in the last 20 years have been destroyed in the last year. In computer science, this would have been one option where Russia had a possibility for the future, and with the companies like Yandex, Kaspersky, and Kontakte, with a big number of high qualified IT specialists, and many of these people now have left the country. They probably have left for good. They have found positions in other countries, and they're not going to go back to a nation where there's a danger of being mobilized to fight in a war, and where you're cut off from international networks. And so here the damage inflicted is indeed massive. I mean, Russia is losing in this international race, for example, in artificial intelligence, where China and the United States are really the two big nations that are competing. Russia had a foot in the door until recently with quantum computing, for example, where they were not that bad and had some good institutions. All this has now been destroyed, and it won't come back. And this is kind of the damage that you don't really see at the moment when you just look at the numbers that are being published. But this is the damage that in the long run will really matter.
We're going to have to leave it there. I want to say a big thanks to you, Michael. That's Michael Rochlitz, Professor of Institutional Economics and Russia Analyst at the University of Bremen. Thank you also to our viewers for watching. If you'd enjoyed this, please check out our other DW Business specials. You can also watch Business Beyond on YouTube. We'll be back with you next week for more. Until then, take care.